The land stretched wide and empty beneath the copper evening sky. Miles of sagebrush rolled into the distance, broken only by rugged hills and the jagged line of mountains far beyond. To most, it was a place of silence and desolation. To Caleb Turner, it was home. He rode his bay gelding along the fence line, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of another long day. The cattle had strayed again, and a section of fencing had collapsed under the pressure of restless steers. Caleb said little to himself, as always. Words were wasted when there was no one around to hear them. The horse's hooves struck the dry earth with a steady rhythm. Dust clung to Caleb's worn boots, his hat pulled low over a face lined not with age but with years of weather and solitude. He was 33, though many mistook him for older. The hard sun of New Mexico and the harder turns of life had carved him into a man of silence, one who kept his distance from most folk and seemed to prefer the company of cattle to men. When he reached the broken section of fence, he swung down and set to work. The storm clouds were gathering thick in the west, already turning the horizon the color of bruised steel. The air smelled of rain and dust, the kind of storm that swept across the plains without mercy. Caleb moved quickly, hands steady as he hammered posts back into place, the sound echoing faintly in the lonely dusk. He had been doing this kind of work since he was a boy. His father once stood beside him, guiding his hands, showing him how to mend wood and drive nails true. His mother had been waiting at the house with supper and a smile, the sound of her voice carrying across the yard when she called the men in from work. That was before sickness took them both within a single winter, leaving Caleb at 17 to hold the ranch together. He had tried. Lord knew he had tried. But grief changed a man, and so did betrayal. Some of the neighbors, men his father once trusted, came sniffing like coyotes, eager to buy the land cheap or take the cattle in trade for debts Caleb never owed. When he refused, they spread talk about him, called him stubborn, said he was too young, too strange, too wild to deal with. Over the years, the whispers settled into truth in the minds of the townsfolk. Caleb Turner became the quiet loner on the edge of town, a man of few words and fewer friends. He didn't care much, or at least that was what he told himself. The land was enough, the cattle needed him, the fences didn't betray, and the horses didn't lie. Still, there were nights when the silence pressed too heavy, when the empty chair at the table seemed to mock him. Loneliness was a thing he carried like a stone in his chest. The first drops of rain hit his shoulders as he finished tying the last section of wire. He pushed his hat lower, jaw tight. The storm was coming fast, lightning already cracking across the far horizon. He gathered his tools, swung onto his gelding, and urged the horse toward home. By the time he reached the yard, the sky had split open. Rain poured in sheets, drumming against the tin roof of the barn and the clapboard sides of the house. The wind howled through the cottonwoods by the creek, sending branches thrashing like angry hands. Caleb led the horse into the barn, patting its neck before latching the stall. He was about to turn toward the house when something caught his eye. At first he thought it was the storm playing tricks, shadows where they didn't belong. But when the next flash of lightning lit the yard, his heart jolted. Something hung from the roof of the barn, swaying in the wind. Caleb strode out into the rain, squinting upward. His breath caught sharp in his throat. It was a woman. Her body dangled limp, bound by rope at the wrists, her dress torn and plastered to her by the rain. Long blonde hair, darkened by water, whipped in the wind. Across the front of her gown, burned into the fabric, were two words that made Caleb's stomach turn cold. Apache Lover. He froze for half a heartbeat, stunned. Who would do such a thing? Tie a woman up there like a dead coyote, leave her in the storm with that cruel brand across her clothing. The lightning cracked again, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Caleb moved. He ran for the ladder by the shed, dragging it through the mud until he could prop it against the barn. Climbing quickly, boots slipping on the wet rungs, he reached the eaves and pulled at the knots that held her. The ropes were tight, biting into her pale wrists. He worked with a pocket knife until the strands gave way, and then she collapsed into his arms, light as a child, but limp, frighteningly limp. Caleb slung her carefully over his shoulder, climbing down with steady strength despite the rain. At the bottom, he shifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. Her face was ghostly pale, streaked with mud and blood. Her lips parted slightly, breath faint, but still there. Relief rushed through him. She was alive, though barely. He carried her quickly toward the house, boots splashing through puddles. His heart hammered with fury and confusion. Who had left her here? Why brand her with such a name? He knew the cruelty of men, had seen it more than once in this country, but this was something else. Inside, he kicked the door shut against the wind and laid her gently on the old couch by the fire. The flames had burned low, but he stoked them with quick hands until warmth flickered across the room. She stirred faintly, her lashes fluttering, but did not wake. Caleb stood over her, water dripping from his hat brim, his breath ragged in his chest. He didn't know who she was or why fate had flung her into his path. All he knew was that someone had meant for her to die, and he couldn't let that happen. For the first time in years, the silence of his house was broken, not by words, but by the fragile sound of another human's breathing. And as he looked down at the bruised, broken woman on his couch, Caleb Turner felt a storm far stronger than the one outside begin to rise inside his heart. The storm had not eased by the time Caleb found himself moving about the dimly lit cabin, every step purposeful, yet heavy with unease. The woman lay stretched on his couch, soaked garments clinging to her frail body, her skin cold beneath the flicker of firelight. He fetched a wool blanket from the trunk near his bed, draping it gently over her form. The fabric swallowed her small frame, making her look even more breakable. He crouched beside her, listening for the rhythm of her breathing. It came shallow, uneven, but steady enough to reassure him she still clung to life. Her wrists, raw from the rope, bore deep red grooves. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen cattle tied less cruelly. He rose and filled a basin with warm water from the kettle, then returned with a rag. His hands were rough from years of labor, scarred and calloused, but they moved with a carefulness few men would believe him capable of. He cleaned the dirt and blood from her skin, brushing tangled strands of hair back from her face. Under the grime, he saw she was young, maybe mid-20s, with features too fine for the frontier, delicate cheekbones, soft lips, the trace of freckles across a pale nose. She looked like she belonged in some eastern town, not on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. As he worked, she stirred faintly. A soft moan escaped her lips, her eyelids fluttering. Caleb froze, rag in hand. Slowly her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then darting about the unfamiliar room. When they settled on him, fear flared in them like a startled deer. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now." Her lips moved soundlessly, then a whisper came, hoarse and broken. Who are you?" "Name's Caleb Turner. This is my ranch." He leaned back slightly, giving her space. "Found you out there. Someone tied you up on my barn roof." Her brows knit, confusion shadowing her pale face. Then she remembered. Her gaze fell to the blanket, to the burned words on her ruined dress beneath. A shudder ran through her, and she pulled the blanket tighter, as if to hide from the shame seared into the fabric. "They wanted me to die," she whispered. Her voice cracked, tears glistening in her eyes, though she fought them back. "They wanted everyone to see." Caleb said nothing at first. He was not a man of many words, but the silence between them felt heavy, demanding something more than his usual quiet. "Well, you didn't die. Not tonight." Her eyes lifted to him again, wary, searching. Why did you help me?" He shrugged, though the question cut deeper than she likely knew. "Couldn't leave you to the storm. Or them." For a long moment neither spoke. The fire popped, wind rattled the shutters, and the storm raged outside. Inside, the woman clutched the blanket, trembling still. Caleb set the rag aside and leaned his elbows on his knees. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her lips pressed together as if weighing whether it was safe to answer. Finally, she whispered, "Evelyn. Evelyn Hart." Caleb repeated it under his breath, as though committing it to memory. Evelyn. Her eyes softened for just a heartbeat, then filled again with fear. "They'll come back. They'll know I survived. They'll come here and then... Let me worry about that." His tone was firm, leaving little room for argument. Evelyn turned her face to the fire, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time since he found her, Caleb felt something stir in him besides anger. A pull. Protectiveness. It caught him off guard, but he didn't push it away. He rose and went to the kitchen, heating more water, cutting bread, slicing some smoked meat he had left from last week. He brought the plate to her and set it on the table beside the couch. "You need to eat." She looked at the food, then back at him, suspicion lingering. But hunger won. With trembling hands, she tore off a piece of bread and chewed slowly, as if each bite reminded her she was still alive. Caleb watched quietly, arms crossed, though he made sure not to stare too hard. When she'd eaten enough to take the edge off, she leaned back, exhaustion settling over her like a second blanket. Caleb thought she might fall asleep again, but then her voice came, soft and halting. "I was a teacher," she said, eyes on the fire. "Back east, I taught children letters and numbers. When I came here, I thought I could do the same. Thought maybe I could make a difference." She paused, swallowing hard. "But some folks don't want change. They don't want kindness." Her voice cracked again. She pulled the blanket tighter, curling against the couch. Caleb didn't press her for more. He could hear the story written in her tone. She had tried to help someone others despised, and cruelty had been her reward. He knew enough about hatred on the frontier to understand the rest. The firelight cast long shadows on the log walls. Outside, thunder rolled farther away, the storm beginning to pass. Caleb sat back in his chair, arms resting on his knees, and let his eyes rest on the woman this stranger fate had thrown into his life. She would bring trouble. He knew it as surely as he knew the cattle needed water each dawn. The men who had left her for dead wouldn't forgive her survival. They wouldn't forgive him either for saving her. He should have been thinking about the risk, the danger. But all he could see was the way her breathing had steadied, the way she clutched that blanket as though it was her last shield against the world. And all he could feel was a quiet certainty he hadn't known in years. He couldn't send her away. The storm had passed outside, but in Caleb Turner's chest, a different kind of storm was only just beginning. The dawn came pale and quiet, the kind of morning where the earth seemed to hold its breath after a storm. The air was washed clean, heavy with the scent of wet sage and damp earth. Caleb stepped onto the porch, hat low over his brow, and breathed it in. The yard was a mess of puddles and wind-tossed branches, but the barn still stood. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney of the house behind him. Inside, Evelyn Hart was still asleep. He had barely slept himself, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. He'd spent half the night in the old chair by the fire, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, half expecting her to stop at any moment. She hadn't. Each rise and fall of her chest had been steady, as if her body was clinging stubbornly to life despite everything. Now, as the first rays of light touched the land, Caleb felt the weight of what he'd taken on. Trouble was coming. He could feel it in his bones as surely as he felt the damp in the air. But when he thought of her lying there, pale and broken, he knew he wouldn't have chosen differently. He saddled his horse and rode out to check the cattle, leaving her with water and bread by the fire. The herd was restless, spooked from the storm, but nothing he couldn't handle. The work kept his hands busy, but his mind refused to quiet. Every time he thought of the burned words on her dress, a fire lit in his chest. By the time he returned, the sun stood higher, glinting off the puddles in the yard. He pushed open the door, half expecting to find her still asleep. Instead, she was sitting up on the couch, wrapped in the wool blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders like pale gold against the rough fabric. She looked fragile, yet her eyes met his with a strength that surprised him. "You're back," she said softly, as if testing her voice in the quiet. He nodded, setting his hat on the peg by the door. Cattle don't wait on storms. A faint smile touched her lips before it faded again. She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket. I'm sorry for causing you trouble. If you'd rather I left. You're not leaving, Caleb said firmly, the words out before he could think. Her eyes widened slightly, as though she hadn't expected him to sound so certain. He shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat. Not till you're strong enough to stand on your own feet, and even then, we'll see. She looked at him a long moment, then lowered her gaze, her shoulders relaxing just a little. For the first time since he found her, she seemed less like a hunted animal, and more like a woman trying to believe she was safe. In the days that followed, Evelyn's strength returned slowly. She moved carefully, her wrists still bandaged, her steps light as though she expected the ground to give way beneath her. Caleb brought her meals, fetched water, and did what little he could to ease her discomfort, though he never hovered. He wasn't a man who knew how to hover, but he noticed the way she watched him sometimes, quiet and thoughtful, as if trying to understand the shape of the man who had saved her. It was Evelyn who began to change the rhythm of the house. One morning while Caleb worked outside, she rose from the couch and tidied the kitchen table, stacking the plates and wiping crumbs he hadn't bothered to notice. Another day, she found his mother's old broom in the corner and swept the floor with slow, careful strokes. Caleb said nothing, but when he returned from the barn and saw the room neater than it had been in years, something stirred in him he hadn't expected. One afternoon, she asked for paper and pencil. He dug through a drawer and brought her a stub of lead and a few yellowed sheets. She sat by the fire and began to write, her head bent, hair falling forward. When he asked what she was writing, she smiled faintly. Letters, words, lessons. It helps me remember who I was before. He didn't press her. But that evening, when she offered to read aloud, he found himself listening more closely than he'd listened to anything in years. Her voice was soft, carrying rhythm and warmth that filled the cabin in ways silence never had. The ranch began to feel different, though Caleb would never have admitted it outright. The empty chair at the table no longer mocked him. It was filled. The quiet evenings no longer pressed heavy. Her voice gave them life. It unsettled him, how quickly she had become part of the place. Yet he couldn't bring himself to resist it. Still, the outside world did not stay quiet. When Caleb rode into town for supplies, the whispers had already begun. Men paused in their conversations when he entered, eyes following him with suspicion. Women at the mercantile glanced at one another and shook their heads. "Reckon he's keeping her at his place," one voice muttered as he passed. "The school teacher, the one they marked." Another voice, lower but edged with venom. "A man's asking for trouble, sheltering the likes of her." Caleb ignored them, as he always did, but the words burned. He paid for his goods and left without a word, though he felt every stare on his back. Trouble was closer than he had hoped. That evening, as he unloaded supplies from the wagon, Evelyn came to the doorway. Her hair was tied back, her dress cleaner though still worn. She studied his face as he set down the sacks of flour and beans. "They're talking, aren't they?" she asked softly. He looked up sharply. "Doesn't matter what they say." "But it does," she whispered. "You're risking everything by keeping me here. Your land, your reputation, maybe even your life." Caleb set down the sack with a heavy thud and turned to face her fully. His eyes, steady and unflinching, met hers. "Listen to me. I don't care what they say. You needed saving, I saved you. That's the end of it." Her eyes shone in the fading light, tears threatening, but held back. She looked at him as though searching for something to anchor herself to, and for the first time in days, a genuine smile broke across her face. Small, hesitant, but real. In that moment, something shifted between them. Neither spoke it aloud, but it was there, in the quiet space of the ranch house, in the way their gazes lingered just a moment too long. It was not yet love, but it was the beginning of something, fragile, dangerous and impossible to ignore. The days stretched on, filled with work and small moments that grew heavier with unspoken meaning. Caleb taught Evelyn to saddle a horse, his large hands guiding hers on the worn leather straps. She laughed nervously when she mounted, clutching the reins too tightly, but he was patient, walking beside her until she found her balance. That laugh, light, almost startled, echoed in his chest long after the sound faded. One evening, she cooked a meal from the supplies he had brought, a simple stew with bread, warmed by the fire. Caleb sat at the table, spoon in hand, and found himself remembering nights long ago when his mother had set food before him with the same care. The taste was plain, yet it carried something he hadn't felt in years, the sense of home. But shadows lingered, even in warmth. At night, Evelyn sometimes woke with a cry, haunted by dreams she wouldn't speak of. Caleb would wake too, sitting silently nearby until her breathing calmed. She never asked him to stay, and he never said why he did. It was enough. The whispers in town grew louder with each passing week, and Caleb knew the men who had left her for dead would not stay idle forever. Yet when he looked at Evelyn across the fire, her face lit by the soft glow, he also knew he would not let her go. Not to them, not to anyone. She had brought life back to a house that had long since gone quiet. And though neither dared admit it yet, both knew something had begun between them that no storm, no gossip, and no cruelty could easily tear apart. The days of peace did not last. Caleb had known they wouldn't, though he hadn't spoken the thought aloud. Evelyn's presence at the ranch was like a lantern burning in the dark, warm, comforting, but visible from far too far away, and men with cruel hearts were drawn to such a light. It began with a sense of being watched. Caleb noticed it when he rode out to check the herd, the way the cattle shifted uneasily, heads lifting toward the hills as if they sensed something lurking. Once or twice he caught the faint glint of metal in the distance, quickly gone when he turned his eyes that way. He said nothing to Evelyn, but his hand lingered closer to the rifle slung across his saddle. She noticed anyway. She was perceptive, always studying him in silence before she dared to speak. One evening, as he came in from the barn, she asked softly, "They're out there, aren't they?" He paused in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim. He could have lied, but there was no point. She already knew. "Yes," he said finally, hanging his coat. "They're waiting." Her face paled, but she nodded as though she'd expected no other answer. Then, "It's only a matter of time." Caleb crossed the room, crouched by the fire, and added another log. The flames leapt higher, their glow casting shadows across his weathered face. "We'll be ready." She looked at him a long moment, her eyes full of guilt. "I should leave. If I go, they'll follow me, and you'll be safe." "No." His voice cut sharp, final. He turned to face her, his expression unyielding. "You leave here, you won't last a day. They'd find you, and it'd end the way they meant it to end that night on my barn. I'm not letting that happen." Her lips trembled. "But I'm the reason they'll burn everything you've built. Your land, your cattle, your life. You're risking it all for me." Caleb rose, his height towering over her, but his eyes softened as they held hers. "This land's been nothing but silence for years. You've given it something I thought was gone forever. That's worth the risk." She blinked at him, stunned into silence, and in that moment, something in her heart steadied. She didn't argue again. The next days were filled with preparation. Caleb repaired the fences with more care than usual, not just for cattle, but for defense. He reinforced the barn door, stacked firewood near the house, and made sure his rifle was cleaned and loaded. Evelyn helped where she could, though her hands still bore scars. She carried buckets of water, gathered kindling, and even stood beside him as he checked the rifle sights, listening intently as he explained their weight and aim. At night, she sometimes woke from nightmares, her cries muffled against the pillow. Caleb would rise from his chair by the fire and sit at her side until the fear passed. He never touched her unless she reached for him first, never spoke more than a few words, but his steady presence anchored her. In the dark silence, she came to trust that he would not leave her. The attack came sooner than either expected. It was near midnight when the first sound reached him. A faint shuffle outside, the nervous whicker of a horse. Caleb rose instantly, every sense alive. He crossed to the window and peered out. Shapes moved in the moonlight, shadows slipping along the edge of the barn. Then he saw it, a flicker of orange, a torch lifted high. "Evelyn," he said sharply, turning back to her. She sat up on the couch, eyes wide, already sensing what he had. "Stay low. Don't open that door unless I tell you." Fear flashed across her face, but she nodded. Caleb grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, and stepped onto the porch. The night was alive with wind, carrying the smell of kerosene. Across the yard, 3 men stood near the barn, torches blazing in their hands. Their faces twisted with malice, shadows dancing across them in the firelight. "You've got something that don't belong to you, Turner," one of them called, his voice rough with drunken hatred. "Hand her over, or you'll lose more than that barn tonight." Caleb raised the rifle, steady as stone. "You'll put those torches out and ride on, or you'll answer for it here and now." The men laughed, cruel and mocking. One flung his torch onto the barn roof. Flames caught instantly, racing along the dry wood with a hungry roar. The horses inside screamed, kicking at their stalls. Caleb's blood surged hot. He fired once, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The torchbearer dropped, his torch rolling into the mud. The others cursed, drawing pistols. Bullets whined past as Caleb ducked behind the porch post, returning fire with deadly precision. Inside, Evelyn clutched the blanket, terror rising in her chest. She heard the shots, the shouts, the roar of the barn aflame. She could not sit idle. Grabbing the water bucket by the hearth, she flung open the door and ran into the yard. "Evelyn!" Caleb barked, but she ignored him, racing toward the barn. Smoke poured from the roof, flames licking higher. She seized the latch of the nearest stall and pulled until the gate burst open, the terrified horse bolting into the night. She moved to the next, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. Caleb's heart clenched, but he couldn't leave her unguarded. He shot another man's hat clean off, forcing him to duck. The last of them cursed and fired wildly, his bullets striking the dirt at Caleb's boots. Then, from the dark edges of the yard, lanterns appeared. Neighbors, men who had whispered against Caleb for months, had been drawn by the fire and the gunshots. Now they came, rifles in hand, voices raised. "What in God's name?" one of them shouted, then saw the men with guns and the flames devouring the barn. "Put those down!" The attackers cursed, retreating as more rifles cocked. One stumbled, bleeding from Caleb's shot. Another dragged him toward the horses. They mounted and galloped into the night, leaving the barn crackling with fire. Caleb rushed forward, dropping his rifle to seize Evelyn's arm as she staggered from the smoke. She was coughing, her face streaked with soot, but she clutched the halter rope of the last horse she'd saved. "You fool," he muttered, voice rough with fear, but his arms wrapped around her all the same. She buried her face against his chest, trembling, and he held her tighter than he ever had. Behind them, neighbors formed a line, passing buckets from the creek. Together they fought the fire, beating back the flames until only smoldering timbers remained. The barn was ruined, but not all was lost. The cattle still lived, the house stood, and the attackers had fled. As dawn bled across the sky, weary men leaned on their rifles, faces grim. Some looked at Caleb with new respect. Others avoided his eyes, ashamed of their silence before. Evelyn stood beside him, soot-smudged, her dress singed, yet her chin lifted with quiet defiance. One of the neighbors finally spoke. "Those men won't be back, Turner, not after this." Caleb said nothing, but his hand remained on Evelyn's shoulder, steady and protective. She looked up at him, eyes brimming with unshed tears, and whispered so only he could hear. "I told you I'd bring ruin." He turned to her, brushing soot from her cheek with a touch gentler than he knew himself capable of. "You didn't bring ruin, Evelyn. You brought me something worth fighting for." Her breath caught, and in that moment, with the wreckage smoldering around them, the bond between them deepened into something unspoken, yet undeniable. The night had tested them both, and those scars remained, They had stood together, and Caleb knew with a certainty, as steady as the rising sun, that he would never let her face the darkness alone again. The smoke from the barn lingered for days, seeping into Caleb's clothes, clinging to his skin, and curling through the air whenever the wind shifted. The blackened timbers stood like broken teeth against the pale morning sky, a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. Yet for all the ruin, life still stirred around the ranch. The cattle were safe. The house still stood. And Evelyn was alive, her presence steady beside him as they faced the aftermath together. The neighbors had drifted away after the fire, some with shame in their eyes, others with a kind of respect Caleb hadn't seen in years. They had helped douse the flames, but when dawn came, they returned to their own farms, leaving him and Evelyn in the silence of smoldering ash. Caleb hadn't asked for their approval, and he didn't need it. What mattered now was that Evelyn was safe. She worked alongside him as the days passed, despite the smoke that made her cough and the soot that darkened her hands. She insisted on helping clear the charred beams, her determination steady even when he told her to rest. "It's my fight, too," she said one morning, gripping the handle of a shovel with blistered palms. Caleb couldn't argue. She had risked her life to free the horses, had faced the smoke and fire without flinching. The barn might have burned, but her courage had burned hotter, and he would not deny her place in the rebuilding. Together they stacked the salvageable lumber, sorted nails from ash, and spread fresh soil over the scorched earth. At night, they sat by the fire inside the house, their shoulders brushing as fatigue wrapped around them. Words were few, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, of gratitude, of something deeper neither dared name aloud. One evening, as Evelyn stirred a pot of beans on the stove, Caleb sat at the table, sharpening his knife. He watched her as the lamplight caught the strands of her hair, now clean and brushed, falling over her shoulder like spun gold. She hummed softly under her breath, some half-forgotten tune from a life before this one. The sound wrapped around him like a balm. "Place feels different," he said quietly, almost to himself. She glanced back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Different good or different bad?" He set the knife down, meeting her eyes across the room. "Good." Her cheeks flushed faintly, though she turned back to the pot. "Then maybe it's worth the trouble." The words hung between them, simple yet heavy with meaning. Caleb felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. For years, his house had been little more than walls and a roof, a place to sleep and eat, nothing more. Now, with her presence, it was becoming something he hadn't dared hope for, a home. But Evelyn's shadows had not vanished. At night, she still woke from dreams, her cries muffled, her body trembling with remembered terror. Each time, Caleb was there, his voice low and steady, his hand resting close enough to anchor her, but never so close as to trap her. Slowly, the fear lessened. Slowly, she began to breathe easier. One night, after a particularly fierce dream, she sat by the fire long after he thought she'd returned to sleep. Caleb rose quietly and joined her, lowering himself into the chair across from her. The flames lit her face, highlighting the strain in her eyes. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Men like that, they never stop. Even if those particular ones don't return, there will always be others who think I deserve what they tried to do." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Then let them come. I'll be here." Her gaze flicked to his, startled. "Why? You owe me nothing. You could have let me die that night and spared yourself all this trouble." He held her eyes, steady and unflinching. "Because the night I found you, this place wasn't empty anymore. You gave me something to fight for, something I didn't know I was missing until it was here." For a long moment, neither moved. Evelyn's lips parted, her breath catching in her throat. Then, slowly, she reached across the space between them, her hand trembling as it brushed against his. Caleb's fingers closed around hers, rough and strong, yet gentler than she thought possible. The warmth of his touch sent tears to her eyes, not from fear, but from the release of it. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Truly safe. From that night on, the bond between them deepened. They worked side by side, rebuilding the barn, their laughter mingling with the sound of hammers and saws. Evelyn learned to measure and cut wood, to hold nails steady while Caleb's hammer struck true. She stumbled, cursed softly, and laughed at herself, and Caleb found himself smiling in ways he hadn't in years. When spring came, wildflowers bloomed in the fields beyond the creek. Evelyn gathered them in her hands, tying them with scraps of ribbon she'd saved from her old dress. She placed them in a jar on the table, their colors bright against the rough wood. "Every home needs a touch of beauty," she said with a smile, and Caleb could not disagree. The town still whispered, of course. Some called her ruined, others called him a fool. But the neighbors who had come that night began to shift. They had seen Evelyn's bravery, Caleb's determination, and the fire that had nearly destroyed them both. Respect replaced suspicion in some eyes, and though it was a slow change, it was real. Caleb didn't care much what they thought, but he knew Evelyn noticed. And it mattered to her that not everyone looked at her with scorn anymore. One afternoon, as they stood by the nearly finished barn, Evelyn turned to him. Her hair caught the sunlight, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen before, hope. "I never thought I'd feel at home again," she admitted softly. "Not after everything, but here, with you, I do." Caleb looked at her, the words caught in his chest. He wasn't a man who spoke easily, but some truths demanded to be said. He stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. "You saved me too," he said. His voice was rough, but steady. "This ranch, this life, it was empty before you. I didn't know how empty until you filled it." Her breath trembled, tears brimming in her eyes. Then she rose onto her toes, her lips brushing his in a kiss as soft as the whisper of spring wind through the grass. Caleb's arms closed around her, strong and certain, pulling her against him. For the first time, the loneliness that had haunted him for years cracked and fell away, replaced by something fierce and whole. From then on, the ranch was no longer Caleb's alone. It was theirs. The barn stood rebuilt by summer, sturdier than before, its beams strong and true. The cattle grazed peacefully, the horses whickered in their stalls, and the land stretched wide and open beneath the endless sky. In the evenings, Evelyn read aloud by the fire, her voice carrying warmth through the house. Caleb sat beside her, listening, the weight in his chest gone. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, Caleb stood on the porch with Evelyn beside him. She leaned against him, her hand tucked in his, and together they watched the light spill across the land. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. He looked down at her, his eyes soft. "Neither are you." And with that, the silence of the plains was no longer empty, but alive, with love, with laughter, with the promise of a future neither had dared to dream. In the wide silence of the frontier, two broken souls found strength in each other and built a love as enduring as the land itself. What began with cruelty and fire ended with hope, and the promise of a home filled not with loneliness, but with laughter and love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale brings you closer to the heart of the untamed frontier, and to romances that rise from hardship into something unforgettable. Stay tuned so you won't miss the next story waiting to be told.